Welcome everybody. Today is class 6 on personal economics. Now, so far we have considered the organization as a relatively peaceful place. However, as you know, and maybe already have experienced, organizations are also a place of competition. So think about competition between employees for example, the highest sales result, or competition between employees for an internal vacancy or a promotion. Now, this kind of competition can cause employees to excel in their performance, but as we will see in extreme circumstances, competition can also lead to conflict or can also undermine employees' performances. Organizations, they are very much aware of the competitive dynamics between employees, and they also draw on a typical of practices to steer competition between employees in a way that are efficient and effective to them, so economic to them. And in doing so, organizations not only motivate employees, so we're back at motivation here, but it can also help through competition to further develop employees, for example, through promotions. Now, the most popular practice that deals with this competition that organizations use to steer employees, this is the tournament. This is also the main topic of today. So we'll first introduce the tournament in organizations, and then we'll talk about what happens when employees try to sabotage each other in a tournament, or even collude, so collaborate with each other against the organization. And finally, I will discuss how some employee characteristics, for example, gender, can influence the dynamics in tournaments within organizations. So, at the end of today's lecture, I hope you understand that tournaments, that they are concerned with relative rewards, whereas other incentive schemes that we have seen so far, they deal with absolute rewards. So this actually offers organizations two buttons to steer employees' motivations and ultimately also the kind of employees they attract. So another main lesson of today is that tournaments offer a couple of unique advantages compared to other incentive systems. So for example, that tournaments can be used for promotion purposes, that they can absorb some of the risks that employees are exposed to, or that they can even economize on costs that organizations have to make for performance evaluations. So I hope that after today you will be able to recognize the dynamics and the advantages and disadvantages of tournaments within organizations. Now, so today's lecture corresponds to chapter 20, 21, and 23, so not 22. And again, some parts, especially the first one, might be a bit more theoretical, a bit more mathematical, but as always, I focus on the message behind the math. So use the slides as a way to read the book. First, little throwback. So as I said before, the basis for tournaments is a difference between absolute and relative performances. So they constitute two ways of looking at performance of employees within organizations, and two buttons that organizations also can use to motivate employees. Now, so far we have mainly looked at absolute performance. For example, if we look back at the study at Safe Light Auto Glass by Lazier, employees were paid per windshield. So this is an absolute type of performance, simply because it's not tied to the performance of others. If an employee at Safe Light replaces more windshields, he or she will get more money, regardless of the amount of replacements that his or her colleagues make. However, in a lot of other different settings in life, we are evaluated and also sometimes rewarded on our relative performance. So that is our performance in comparison to others. I think the best example you can think of here is professional sports. So when you're a swimmer, how well you perform also depends on how your competitors perform. If I would compete in a swimming contest with some toddlers, then I guarantee you that I will win. But if I would compete with some Olympic swimmers, then I guarantee you that I would lose. Same, for example, with an entrance exam, which is required for some studies, like if you want to enter med school. So they typically employ a numerous fixes, say the top 30% are allowed to enter. So this also means that your chance of entering strongly depends on who shows up. If only the high-performing students show up, then your chances decline. If only the low-performing students show up, then you have a higher chance of belonging to the top 30%. Similar example we see in classrooms, and this with the practice of grading the curve. Now, contrary to what some of you guys might think, grading is actually very hard. How do we distinguish objectively between a student that scores a 7 and a 7.5? So therefore, a lot of teachers, they will grade the curve, while there's also some ethical reasons for not doing this. But grading the curve typically entails so that students who perform average in the group, they will get like a 7 or a 7.5. Everybody who scores below the average of the group, they get a 6 or a 6.5. And students who get better, they maybe get an 8 or an 8.5. And this regardless of the level of the students, while actually the level that students have in a certain course might vary very much from year to year. So just give the same grade curve regardless of the performance of the students in absolute terms. So these are all examples, so the professional sports, the medical studies, grading the curve, where your relative performance matters. But of course, these examples do not have to do with organizations. However, there are some examples where your relative, rather than your absolute performance, counts within an organizational context. First example is giving bonuses to employees. So bonuses are often awarded to the best performing employees in an organization or organizational unit. So the best performer relative to others in the organization. Second example are relative reward schemes. When a reward is allocated to employees' share in the performance, for example. Imagine a sales team, and they sell a lot of cars. So they throw all their profit, let's say, in a giant jar, and then they divide, at the end of the day, each team member's share proportionally to the amount of cars they have sold. So who sold the most cars gets the most, and so on. Other example, which we also see later in this class, is that of fruit pickers. So for example, a relative reward scheme of fruit pickers, that they are paid according to the average kilograms of fruit that the group picks in a day. For example, the average in the group is 20 kilos a day. So if I pick 13 kilograms a day, I will be rewarded less. If I pick 25 kilograms a day, then I will be rewarded more. So these are relative reward schemes. Final example are tournaments. So in a tournament, a prize or a promotion is awarded to the best performer in a team. And as we see later, this is very effective as it can also change the kind of employees you attract. But it's also a way in which organizations can motivate employees without that they have to spend more money. Now, if I have to pay an employee per car sold, I have to pay him or her a commission every time they sell a car. If I do it via a tournament, I can invest in like one cash prize or one cash bonus, and I motivate all the employees, also the employees that will not necessarily win this prize. You'll also notice on the slide I've put some pictures here of the big four consultancies. So Ernst & Young, or EY as they are called today, KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and Deloitte. I've put them there because I believe throughout this course it's good to keep some kind of a sales and consultancy context in your head. This is of course not to say that relative performance only counts in these contexts, but I wanted to mention that big four firms, they typically adopt a type of promotion tournaments with young graduates. So they hire many young graduates, and you have probably already seen these firms advertising or recruiting graduates somewhere on campus or in the city already. But the catch is that they offer limited fixed positions. So the many graduates then have to compete with each other for a fixed position. So in these ways, these big four consultancy firms, they manage to yield promotion tournaments in favor of motivation and selection of talented employees. Okay, before we continue with tournaments, let's first head back to the basics. So remember the example of catching the Jedi that I gave in class 2. So what I did as a Dark Lord was I paid a Stormtrooper for catching the Jedi. This was a simple exchange of pay for a simple task. However, I could also hire 2 Stormtroopers, and I could give a prize or reward to the one who catches the Jedi, either the fastest or catches more Jedi. Now, this is an example of a tournament because it describes a situation where 2 agents are rewarded based on their performance relative to one another. We can write this in a formula similar to other productivity functions that we have seen for other pay schemes. So both employees, they still get a fixed pay, so A, denoted by the letter A. However, the most productive one will also get an extra reward. So S, so we call this the price. This can be the pay, promotion, can be some other kind of rewards. Performance of both employees depends on their difference in effort plus an error term. So this is the state of nature, environmental factors like luck, economic conditions, and so on. Now, assume that Stormtrooper 2 is more productive than Stormtrooper 1. That Stormtrooper 1 will get A, so the base pay, while Stormtrooper 2 will get A plus B, so base pay plus the price. So difference is rewards between the winner and the loser, and we call this the price spread. Here this is simply S because A plus S minus A equals S. So the difference between the two is simply S in this case. And as some of you might have noted from this simple example, this looks very similar to piece rates, so to a variable B. Only in this case, there's winners and there's losers. And this is very true. So piece rates and tournaments, they are surprisingly similar. First, both piece rates and tournaments, they serve to motivate employees. And second, they do so by stimulating employees' efforts, independent of base pay. So remember, as we saw in class 2, the efforts of rational, self-interested agents, they are not affected by base pay. So offering somebody 2,000 or 2,200 euros a month won't necessarily induce that person to perform more. But what piece rates and tournaments jointly do is they tie money to differences in efforts, so stimulating employees to do their best. The main difference between piece rates and tournaments, however, is how employees will be rewarded. So under piece rates, rewards simply increase with employees' own efforts. So employees under piece rates, they are sure of their own rewards because it only depends on their own efforts. Under tournaments, however, this is a whole different story. So whether you will get your rewards as an employee depends on who your colleagues are. Working harder might increase your chances of winning the prize, while hardworking employees, they might decrease your chances of getting the reward or prize. In other words, in a tournament, it's perfectly possible that a very hardworking employee actually earns less than he or she will do under a piece rate. A side note, it's also important to keep in mind that piece rates and tournaments, so they are not necessarily opposites, they can also coexist. Example here is the firm Ergo. So this is a German insurance firm. You can also find it in the Netherlands, of course. So here they combine a piece rate. So employees, they get a piece rate, they get a commission per insurance they sell to clients. But typically, employees with the highest sales, they also get rewards. They're very creative in this kind of rewards. For example, they get their own office for a week, they get a sound bar, they get a pin in the shape of a golden eagle, and I kid you not, that's a real-life example of a reward at Ergo. So this illustrates that rewards and tournaments, they are not necessarily money, but also be more symbolic like motivators, like we saw in class 3. Okay, so short reflection. So tournaments can induce the same behavior among employees as piece rates, even if the rewards for employees are not the same. So employees might perform the same, but will not necessarily be rewarded the same. In doing so, tournaments do save on costs, and that is in a both direct and indirect way. So directly by the fact that employers have to pay less money to employees. And think about it, under piece rate I have to pay for every car sold, for example, while if I organize it via a price, I only have to invest in one price, and it will also motivate the employees who will not pay the price. Can also save money indirectly, and that is by saving on monitoring and evaluation costs. The main reason is that relative performance in organizations is often far more visible than absolute performance. So in other words, if you are a boss of a car sales firm, you might maybe not know exactly how many cars each of your employees sell, so you might not know their exact absolute performance, but often you will have some kind of a general idea about who is the high seller within the firm, or how employees rank to one another in terms of their performance. So you will not maybe have an idea about absolute performance of your employees, but if you're a good boss, you typically have a general idea about the relative performance of your employees. Another reflection point is that tournaments can also help to explain why promoted employees typically get a raise. So from a pure rational economic point of view, it's very strange to give a promoted employee a raise, because this is actually a double prize. One, you get a higher function, and two, you get a higher wage. Besides, if you give an employee a raise of, say, for example, 15%, this does not mean that this employee will suddenly become 50% more productive. So this, from very economic point of view, this seems totally irrational. But in personal economics, this makes perfect sense. So it's a promotion and its associated higher wage. They are a price for which employees compete. So you are indirectly also paying for the motivation of the employees who competed in the tournament in the first place. Finally, it's also important to say that there are important drawbacks to tournaments. One of the main drawbacks of tournaments is that employees, they tend to perform based on how they perceive or think that their colleagues will perform. So if you're a perfectly rational employee in a tournament, the only thing you will need to do is perform just a little bit higher than your competitors, so just enough to secure the prize. But of course, how you perceive other colleagues to perform, this might either be totally wrong, or might also be very difficult to assess. You might not have access to this kind of information. So might also distort performance in some way, tournaments. Okay, thus far we have introduced the basic version of the tournament model. So we had two persons and a prize, and we compared it to piece rates. As always, reality is of course much more complex than this simple model. So let's have a look at a couple of extensions to the basic model. So what happens if we add more people? What happens if we add more prizes? And what happens if we add more stages? So first, when more employees will join a tournament, there's actually two opposing effects that will occur. On the one hand, there is a kind of competition effect. So if more competitors, if more employees join a tournament, it also means if you want to win the prize, you have to outperform more colleagues. So you will have to exert more effort. So adding more employees to a tournament will exert more effort among the employees. On the other hand, there's also very much the counter effect, and that is the 1 divided by n effect. So this means that employees' chances of winning decline as more other employees join the tournament, so which might induce those employees to lower their effort. So as it turns out, there are two opposite effects when more employees join the tournament and they cancel each other out. The result, and the handy result actually for organizations, is that they do not necessarily need to raise the size of the prize when the competition opens up to more participants. So if more employees join the tournament, you don't have to increase the price, you can just stick to the price and you can still keep all employees motivated. Okay, what happens if we add more prizes, and why would we do that in the first place? Well, there might be psychological reasons to add more than one prize. So if you have several places, say for example, also for the second and for the third best performing employee, so then you might be able to attract more employees into the tournament by offering them some low-hanging fruits. Think about it, this is also how lotteries work. So there's often many people who win like, like 1.5 euro. And because those people keep winning something, they also keep playing, so they keep entering the tournament. Another reason for including more prizes might be due to simple ability differences. For example, if I expect my top-selling employee with 35 years of experience to outperform everybody from the start, then I might maybe consider also rewarding the top-selling junior employee or the top-selling employee in another segment or organizational unit. This, of course, to avoid that those employees will not compete because they expect this top-selling employee to get the prize as well. And if you think about it, this is also what pub quizzes, for example, do, by including a booze prize, a prize for the last place, a prize table. So they want, of course, to keep the other quiz players involved, not just the top-performing ones. Okay, finally, what happens if we include multiple stages? Well, so far we have always assumed that everybody was performing at the same time. For example, that employees are all selling cars at the same time. We call this simultaneous move games, and they're also the dominant form of tournaments in organizations. Now, what characterizes these simultaneous move games is that employees generally have limited knowledge of what the others are doing. So they focus on their own performance, and afterwards the result is known, say, at the end of the day or at the end of the week. The tournaments can also take place in sequential order, so with employees taking turns. Think, for example, about a sales tournament where the best seller will get a promotion, and these sales results are, let's say, displayed in the lunchroom on a big billboard, so a kind of sales team dashboard. And every time employees enter this lunchroom, they see this board, so they receive a kind of feedback on their performance, and they can adjust their efforts. Problem we see in organizations is that such sequential tournaments, that they often undermine employees' performance. So top performers will see that they are the best, and they will lower their efforts. So we call this coasting. Low performers, on the other hand, they will see, okay, we suck, and they will lose their performance. So they will give up on the tournament. In other words, interim feedback can result in both top and low performers reducing their efforts. So it's very good for organizations to be very careful with this kind of information, so to limit interim feedback that is given to employees in tournaments. Instead of sequential orders, there can also be multiple stages in a tournament. And this is best explained with professional sports, but keep in mind also occurs in organizations. I will come to that later. So there's two types of multiple stage contests, a round-robin tournament and an elimination tournament. First is the round-robin tournament, and you will remember this for the rest of your life because it has my name in it. And a typical example of a round-robin tournament is a national football league competition in a country. So every team plays against every team, or every player against every player, and then the points are added up. Second is elimination tournament. There you have to keep in mind the Football World Cup or Euro Cup. So only the winners get to the next changes. The losers are eliminated. Examples of multi-stage tournaments in organizations are promotion ladders. Think, for example, about the Big Four consultancy firms, the example I gave earlier. So they hire many graduates. These graduates compete for a junior position. The juniors compete for senior positions. The seniors ultimately compete for a burnout or an associate position, and so on, until you get to CEO. Now, this example is more in line with an elimination tournament. So elimination tournaments, rather than round-robin tournaments, fit the context of tournaments in organizations better. If you do well on the promotion ladder, if you think about it, you actually get 3 prizes. So there's 2 on slide, it's actually 3. First, you get a new position. Second, you get a pay raise. And 3, you also get option value. So you get the right to compete in the next round. You get the right to compete for a higher level promotion. Ideally, of course, this pay also accelerates as employees move on the corporate ladder, so with the largest raises for the highest positions. Why is that? Because it's linked to the option value. Once you are at the top, your promotion options are more limited. There's also a more competitive environment there. So a larger amount of cash from the organization is required to keep you motivated there. This also helps to explain large CEO pay, because once you are CEO or once you are at the top level position, your option value is very limited. So you can't be promoted to a higher function. This cannot serve as a further incentive, so then you need to have high pay. Overall, another major advantage of tournaments is that they also absorb some risk, especially common shocks that all employees are exposed to. For example, imagine that you sell cars and all of a sudden, boom, there's Dieselgate, and it's a scandal and it's very much affecting sales. Now, if you are paid according to a piece rate, this is a total disaster, because you will sell you will sell less cars, of course, and you will lose income. However, if you are paid in a tournament, then the best seller still gets a bonus. So then it doesn't matter if you sell less cars. If you're still the best seller, you can still get the bonus. So tournaments do not blunt incentives when common shocks occur, because the absolute performance might decline, but the relative performance will largely stay the same. So this is very important for employees and their organizations. Major disadvantage, however, of tournaments is that it conveys important information about employees to other organizations. If you give an employee a promotion, a prize, or an award, you indirectly signal to outsiders that this employee is valuable to the organization. And think about it, especially today with Twitter, with LinkedIn, people are very eager to share that they've gotten a promotion or a prize. And this information is also very easily picked up by other employees. If you think about the recruiters who circle on LinkedIn like vultures. So there is the risk that tournaments can lead to a poaching problem. So poaching problem, term we saw in last class, risk of organizations stealing your employees away. And organizations, they are very much aware of this risk. So that's why in practice, employers will very much refrain from promoting employees. And if they do, in fact, promote employees, they will give them larger raises. Why? Not because those employees have suddenly become more productive, but because they want to avoid that they will leave the organizations. Now, there are, of course, some other disadvantages of tournament as well. One of those disadvantages is that people remain people. So when competing with each other, employees will try to sabotage, of course, or they will collaborate with each other, not always in their own benefit, but also against the organization. Okay, but before we move on, sorry, I can't help it, small note on the origin of the word sabotage. So sabotage comes from the French word sabot, so wooden clog. So think about the Dutch wooden shoes. And laborers during the Industrial Revolution, what they did is they sabotaged machines by putting their clogs in. So this was literally sabotage, putting the clogs in. And saboteur was also supposedly a French derogatory term used for the Dutch. So Napoleon, when having issues with the Dutch, is said to have exclaimed, "Ah, those damn saboteurs, those damn wearers of clogs." Okay, so that was my small history moment, but enough history, back to business. So imagine the following situation. So we have two real estate agents in Tilburg, let's call them Luc and Leia, and they were both working for the same company, so VB&T. However, they serve different parts of the city. So Luc serves in Reeshof, so the fancy west side of the city, and Leia serves the center and the north. Now what happens? One day Leia finds a very attractive property. Small detail, it's in Luc's zone. Question is, will she tell Luc or not? Assuming that Luc and Leia are rational agents, how Leia would respond largely depends on how Luke and Leia are paid. So let's first consider the first scenario, that Luke and Leia are paid according to a piece rate. In a piece rate, there is no harm that Leia will tell Luke about the property. She cannot lose because it won't affect her performance. So she can actually only win, because imagine that she tells Luke about this opportunity. Chances are that he might return the favor one day and also tell her about an opportunity that he saw in her zone. So piece rates, so being rewarded for absolute performance, actually fosters knowledge sharing and helping behavior among coworkers, because they are rewarded according to absolute performance. If they help somebody increase their absolute performance, they cannot lose, they can only win. But now consider the second scenario. So Luke and Leia are part of a tournament and the best performer gets a prize. Now, will Leia tell Luke about the opportunity in this case? Well, she's better not to, because it would increase Luke's chance of winning the tournament. So tournaments and other incentive schemes that are based on relative performance, they actually penalize knowledge sharing and helping behavior among coworkers. And in fact, in extreme circumstances, the tournament setting might even incentivize Leia to sabotage Luke's sales or to influence other people's perceptions of Luke. For example, Leia might engage in office politics. She might spread a rumor about Luke, or she might give him a negative Google review. Okay, nicely illustrates the difference. Good story, but is there evidence to back up? And, well, you hear me coming. Guess what? There is. So, a study that investigated the effect of tournaments on job performance and sabotage is one by Carpenter in 2010. Now, what Carpenter did is they had 160 students, and those students were asked to simply stuff envelopes within a particular time frame. The quality of the stuffed envelopes was then assessed by an independent person from the US Post. They had 4 conditions. So first, simple piece rates. Students would get $1 per quality envelope. Then there was a tournament condition. So they would not only get $1 per quality envelope, but there would also be a prize of $25 for the student who produced the highest amount of quality envelopes. In addition, they also introduced sabotage conditions to the previous 2 conditions. They did this by letting another student who was also in the tournament assess the quality of the letters of the other student. So the results are displayed on the following slide. So we have the different quality measures here in the rows. So the total amount of envelopes, and then the amount of quality envelopes as assessed by a US postal worker and by another student, so a co-worker. Conditions are in the columns. Note that this table has 3 conditions. The reason is that piece rates with sabotage and without sabotage, they were actually the same, so there was no significant difference. There was also no incentives for employees to sabotage in piece rate with tournaments, so these results are not displayed here. There are, however, 3 important things that we can observe in this table. So first is that in the piece rate treatment, students assessed each other's output more generously than did the US postal worker, so a difference of 11.7 instead of 11.12. So maybe we can conclude here that students helped each other, just like in the example with Luke and Leia. Second, if we head to the tournament treatment, we see that other students were less generous than the objective measure, so a difference of 11.3 versus 12.3. But okay, still okay, no real shocking differences here. Finally, if we go to the condition of tournament with sabotage, here we see peer evaluations do affect rankings. So students sabotaged each other. You see here there is a dramatic underestimation. So out of the 12 raw envelopes, let's say about half of them are seen as qualitatively by the other students. So this is also summarized on this slide. So in the Carpenter experiment, piece rates urged employees to help each other. In the tournaments, Students were less generous. Probably there was also a more competitive atmosphere here. But when a sabotage condition was included, we saw that students dramatically and also deliberately underestimated each other's performance. And what is more, Carpenter observed that his sabotage, that it was very much directed, that it was very much targeted at the high-performing students. So this means that it was more likely a rational strategy than it was an emotional response, like jealousy. And the result was that the actual quality also declined. So researchers attributed this to the fact that the students expected sabotage from the competitors, so they didn't do their full best. So this is what we see here. So a strong decline over here. So employees don't do their best because they expect sabotage from competitors, and in the end, it's the organization that loses because they lose out on performance and also on sales. So the Carpenter experiment, it raises some important cautions regarding the use of tournaments in organizations. That is, under tournaments, employees are more likely to sabotage and they are less likely to help each other. Now, this effect can be large enough to make tournaments a less effective incentive scheme than piece rates. This is especially important because sabotage can, of course, include more than just destroying or undervaluing the output of other employees. It can be, for example, failing to help, failing to cooperate, to train, to share important information. And this can be very detrimental in workplaces, especially when some of these behaviors I just mentioned, or cooperation or sharing information, when it is an important aspect of the job, say in healthcare sectors, say in public sectors. So this is detrimental if employees start sabotaging each other. So it's advised that tournaments are not used in these kind of settings. There are, however, some potential solutions that can partly turn back these drawbacks of tournaments. For example, we can lower the price or the price spread as such. So the competition will then become less fierce. If you give a price of 20 euros compared to a price of 1,000 euros, well, employees will engage in less fierce competition for the 20 euros price than they will for the 1,000 euros price. Another thing we can do is we can make cooperation targets just part of job performance. For example, my function, I get evaluated on team criteria as well, and this largely to avoid internal competition in the domain of research. Final thing we can do is we can limit performance feedback. So if employees do not have real-time information about what the other colleagues are doing, they're also less likely to sabotage each other. Now, funny enough, tournaments can also do the opposite. So they can also create too much cooperation between employees. And this is something Bandiera et al. Found out on an English berry farm. So first, the berry farm under scrutiny, they had a piece rate system in place. This piece rate system was based on the amount or kilograms of berries that a fruit picker would pick in a day. It was also a more informal system in the sense that the farm made a compensation dependent on the circumstances, for example, the weather, the state of the field. So in the morning, a farmer would go out, would inspect the field. For example, saw the weather was good. Okay, today the workers get 10 euros per kilo. Okay, today weather is bad. Okay, today they get 15 euros per kilo. Right. You feel it a bit coming, so the system was highly informal, and the farm was a bit bothered by it, so they decided to formalize it more. And they did so by transforming it into a continuous relative reward scheme. So this is a kind of scheme where your compensation depends on the average performance of the group. So here it was the average kilos of berries that the group would have picked during a day. If a fruit picker would pick more than the average of the group, then he or she would get less. If he would pick more than the group, he would get more, and so on. Now, the good intention behind this idea is that the average of the group is some kind of an honest reflection of the daily conditions on the field. When it's a bad day, they will probably pick less on average. When it's a good day, they will probably pick more on average. Okay, Sounds like a good idea? Well, hell no, it wasn't. It totally backfired and was abandoned later. Now, why? First thing that I saw is that there was a very sharp drop in productivity. So the average kilogram of berries that a fruit picker harvested actually decreased, so from 7.98 to 5.01. So that's a staggering drop of about 21%. Now, an initial reason that we could think of is it could be altruism. A good picker does not want to hurt the profits of a bad picker. Well, no, said researchers, because that would be the case if this would be a complex task, but this was very easy. It was just picking berries. The real reason was that these employees actively cooperated to keep the average kilograms in the group artificial low. So this would mean that they all would have to work less for the same money. Now, two factors that directly played into the hands of these berry workers was that the berry farm mostly recruited men in Eastern Europe. And these men, they came together to England, they knew each other well, they had strong social ties. So they could easily reinforce collusion. Second factor that played into the hands of the berry pickers was that this performance was visible. So employees could really see in each other's baskets how full they were. So when they saw a colleague with a very full berry basket, they could say, oh, slow down, you're doing too much. You're going to make it very hard on us. Some important lessons that we can learn from this Bandera experiment, or more this Bandera observation, is that relative incentive systems, so the bigger family of incentive systems to which tournaments and continuous relative reward systems belong, that they are less effective in smaller groups and when employees know each other. Exactly because these kind of situations stimulate collusion, collaborating together. Now, a potential solution that we can try to avoid this is we can try to work with larger groups. So this makes collusion more difficult to organize. You could limit the performance feedback as well, or the visibility of performance at least. Remember, this was also an advice that we gave to reduce sabotage in tournaments. So when relative rewards matter, it's better that employees do not know how others perform. And finally, through a periodic reshuffling or to the promotion of outsiders, it can also help that employees do not develop these kind of strong ties that facilitate collusion in some instances. An alternative explanation why changes in reward systems within organizations sometimes backfire is the ratchet effect. Now, the ratchet effect refers to a situation where employees that are subjected to performance pay choose to restrict their output, and do so because they rationally anticipate that the organization will respond to higher output levels by raising output requirements or by cutting pay. So for your reference, so the ratchet, that's the old school toy, that's the plate here on the side. So you can move it in one direction, but you cannot move it in the other direction without forcing or breaking it, just like the employment relation, of course. In other words, it's a kind of illustration that employees get used to job design. Once certain rewards, once certain tasks are allocated to a job, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for organizations to make changes to it. Because any change in rewards or task in favor of the organization will lead to a restriction in output from the side of the employees. For example, imagine that I have a flower shop. If my shop assistant is responsible for cleaning, and this is part of the original deal I've made with this employee, this is not a problem. However, if I need to cut down on cleaning costs and assign this task later to the shop assistant, say for the same pay, but I do this later, so it's not part of the original package and it's not associated with an increase in rewards, that this employee will react fiercely. Reason is the ratchet effect. And this shouldn't be no surprise if you think back about class 3, where we saw there on hedonic adaptation. So both hedonic adaptation and the ratchet effect, they demonstrate that employees are more sensitive to losses than they are to gains. Now, when you will browse through chapter 21, you will notice that there is a section on risk taking as well. So observational evidence shows that tournaments among stockbrokers, encourage those stockbrokers to make more risky investments. This is problematic, of course, because they're dealing with their clients' money. And the stockbrokers make more riskier investments, especially when these are young stockbrokers and they are behind in the competition. Now, it's a very interesting section, but I will not treat this in today's class, so you can read it if you like. Instead, I would like to devote the remaining attention to look at chapter 23 to see how tournaments are related to different kind of employee characteristics. So indeed, tournaments, they can create a very competitive environment. Some organizations even go at length to cultivate this kind of competitive culture. Naturally, of course, from the belief that cultivating such culture would benefit performance in the end. Example that I have here on the slide is Amazon, which apparently has very much a dog-eat-dog culture and very likes to foster this kind of culture as well. But you can also think about the big four that I talked about earlier in this class. An important question that those organizations have to consider is, by organizing tournaments, by fostering this kind of competitive culture, which type of employees do they want to attract and or repel as well? So remember, we have seen a couple of examples earlier in this course as well. So in class 3, we had the study by Lazier, so where change in incentive schemes change the composition of the workforce. But we also saw effects of self-selection. For example, the study by Coates on the index ring finger ratio of noise traders in London. It also showed that some incentive schemes or some characteristics of the job environment attract people that perform well under these conditions. Now, economic theory suggests that tournaments with organizations that are especially effective to attract employees that, one, like competition, but liking competition, of course, is not enough. They also have to respond well to this competition. So this means that their performance should not decrease, but should be stable, or in ideal circumstances even increase as a result of this competitive environment. Final observation is that tournaments tend to attract more talented employees. So employees that typically have higher abilities, and as a result also higher chances of winning the tournament. Or at least employees that perceive or think this is the case. And I think we all have a particular type of employees in mind when we hear this criteria. For example, salespeople, professional athletes, consultants, and so on. But you see where, I think you have a feeling that you know where I'm going. Is there empirical evidence to support this? And yes, there is. So Leuven et al. They did an experiment among students. So students could choose to enter 3 different competitions, and either they would win a prize of 1,000 in one competition, they would win a prize of 3,000 euros, or a prize of 5,000 euros. Underlying idea was that abler students, so more talented students with higher grades, that they would choose for the competition with the highest prize, so the one with 5,000 euros. While other students, anticipating this would happen, that they would choose for lower price competitions, for example, the one with 3,000 euros or 1,000 euros. And indeed, consistent with this line of reasoning, Leuven et al. Found that the ablest students, so the students with the highest grades, that they self-selected in the high-price tournaments. Furthermore, they also saw that the average grade of students, that they were much higher in the high-price competitions. Very importantly as well, final observation was that difference in performance they observed between the lowest competition and the highest competition, that it had nothing to do with increased efforts of the students, but that the entire performance gaps between the different competitions could be attributed to self-selection. So due to students with higher grades, students who think they would perform better, self-selecting themselves into the highest prize competition. So in other words, tournaments with large prize spreads, so with large difference between winners and losers, they are likely to attract more qualified employees. Another experiment was by Ericsson et al. In 2009, and they did a series of tests, and they left participants with a choice in this experiment. So either they could choose a piece rate or they could choose tournaments. In addition to this experiment, they also measured confidence. Now, what they observed was that people who had low confidence, they would avoid tournaments. Nevertheless, they did observe that by giving participants this choice, they performed better regardless of the scheme. So this means employees with low confidence would actually perform equally as good under piece rates as the confident people would be under tournaments. This is also consistent with other empirical evidence. So confident people, and especially overconfident people, so with an inflated view of their own abilities, those employees are more likely to prefer tournament schemes, and they're also more likely to enter risky markets, for example, as entrepreneurs. Final question of today that I want to address with regards to tournaments is there a kind of gender dimension concerned with tournaments? After all, we do see that women are severely underrepresented in both top positions and competitive industries. Even in a progressive country as the Netherlands, only 28% of top functions within organizations are filled in by women. So could it be possible that women score lower on preferences for competition? It's possible that women have lower confidence and that this explains their low preference in tournaments and competitive industries? Well, hypothetically, of course. And this was one of the questions that Nierelle and Westerlund addressed. And please note, this is a highly cited study on gender and self-selection in tournaments. Now, researchers here, they made teams of 4 participants, each with 2 males and 2 females, and they let them perform a series of calculus tasks. Now, there were 3 rounds of calculating. So first, they did a simple piece rate with 50 cents per correct answer. And the second round is turned into a tournament, so with $2 for the winner. In the third round, they could choose either piece rates or either tournaments. Now, results showed that in the first 2 rounds, so under piece rates and tournaments, both genders performed generally equally. However, when they were given the choice, they did observe that there was a dramatic difference in the preference for tournaments. So 72% of men, they preferred the tournaments, while only 35% of women preferred tournaments over piece rates. Contrary to some opinions, so men and women are actually expected to perform generally the same in calculus tasks. This is also what we find in these kinds of results. So the difference in preference, they cannot be ascribed to differences in abilities, like we found in the Ericsson experiment. Can also not be ascribed to difference in responses to competition or different risk preference, because we found performance remained generally the same. There was also no self-selection happening here because it was controlled. People were assigned to the different groups. So what did explain these results? They actually found that it was greater male confidence, or better, overconfidence. So men were more likely to be overconfident. When they asked directly after the experiment, who do you think would win? 75% of men thought, well, I'm going to win this, while only 43% of women did so. Now, this is, of course, against the statistical odds. So statistical odds is that you would win in 25% of the time, of course, 1 out of 4. So there is overconfidence both from the male side and both from the female side. But the fact that there was a clear gap in overconfidence, this could explain men's self-selection in this kind of tournaments. So the researchers conclude that the overconfidence gap could explain indeed why men tend to self-select in tournaments and competitive industries, and this at the expense of talented women. So women in response, talented women are more likely to select themselves out. This is also exacerbated by other studies which show that men become more competitive if they know they are competing against women. What could we do about it? Well, one way in which this overconfidence could be combated by HR is, for example, giving employees more objective performance feedback to correct this kind of overconfidence. This brings us to today's takeaways. I've adopted here a nice summary from Shiramada, which actually explains a bit the key message of today, explaining the pros and cons of tournaments. So we find on the pro side, indeed, that tournaments, they can create very powerful monetary and non-monetary incentives. So they might also absorb some of the risks that our employees are exposed to, and they can work as a strong selection mechanism to attract talented employees, especially employees who are likely to perform well under internal and external competition. However, on the con side, tournaments, they can also blunt incentives. For example, they can discourage losers, create a more competitive environment. They can induce winners to relax more, to coast more. Can also create counterproductive behaviors, for example, sabotage and collusion. And finally, tournaments, they can also lead to a less diverse workforce, because tournaments induce women to self-select themselves out in organizations that have adopted these kind of incentive schemes. Okay, so that's the main message for today, all summed up here. That's all for today. I hope you stay healthy, I hope you stay safe, and then I see you next week. Then we'll have the final class, and then we will discuss teams. Thank you, and see you next week.